Thank you for having accepted my paper. This is really a pleasure and honor to present here. And yeah, I want to say this is a joint paper with Lennart Reiners from University of Göttingen. All right, so the title is Confined to State, Natural Disasters and Indonesian Migration Ban. So we wanted to motivate this research by knowing that climate change will exacerbate the frequency of extreme weather events, for example, droughts, floods, and so on. And this has been more than established even very recently by the latest IPCC report. I think many of us here are familiar with the concept of migration being an important adaptation strategy to climatic shocks. For the case of international migration, well, the link is still not clear. For example, some studies find that there are no links, some others find there are links. So that's a different story. And our first contribution, I could say, would be to fit into this train of the literature. But we're going to do so from a different perspective. So we're not interested in seeing whether there is any link, but interested in establishing what happens if international migration as a potential adaptation strategy, this adaptation strategy is actually completely taken away. But before going into more details, let me split the literature on the climatic shocks and migration event, international in this case, into three very subjective scenarios. So a first scenario is a scenario in which there are no barriers to migrate internationally, legal barriers. So we can think of this scenario as a scenario of the past, for example, in which it was relatively easy to move from one country to the other, at least legally, until visa requirements and passports were introduced. So this was the era of mass migration. Or we can think of this scenario of the internal migration, basically, where the majority of countries allow for free movement within their borders. Second scenario is a more current scenario, in which there are selective migration policies adopted by the majority of countries. And that's actually such as, for example, visa requirements. Some go even to systems such as point-based system and so on. Whether we are moving towards a scenario with high barriers to migrate internationally, we don't know, obviously, but there is a certain trend. So since the 1990s, there has been a sharp increase in here we show the number of restrictive immigration policies in the world. These are cumulative immigration policies. But the same holds true as well for immigration policies. That's actually what we are going to exploit in our paper. So we don't know, but yes, there is a certain trend. So I hear some background noise somewhere. I don't know, someone. Well, okay. All right. What about the literature on that? As you can imagine, the vast majority of studies focus on the second scenario. Obviously, in the last 50 years, there is one paper we are aware of that focuses on the link between climatic shocks and migration in the era of mass migration. That's from Spitzer and co-authors. They study the effect of the Messina earthquake, the largest ever recorded earthquake in Europe, in 1910. So in the southern Italy, in a period where there was very high immigration from southern Italy, especially to the US. Well, on the second scenario, both at the micro and the macro level, obviously many papers are there. The literature on this third scenario is quite underdeveloped. And that's because it is difficult to find cases where it is countries introduce migration restrictions almost like exogenously, right, without affecting other sectors of the economy and so on. Obviously, one can immediately think of what happened during the pandemics. We were just discussing about moved right before France shut down the borders at the beginning of the pandemic. And that's actually what happened. Many countries, even in Europe, introduced regulations, so introduced basically migration restrictions. But that's something that happened together with a lot of other factors that affected the economy, such as, for example, well, global pandemics. There is one paper that introduces migration restrictions in general into their climatic model, and that's from Bemvist and co-author. And they find that migration restrictions increase the vulnerability of countries to climatic events in general and to climate change. But that's just a model, and that will be actually our main contribution will be to provide a causal evidence on the relationship between migration restrictions and vulnerability of communities to natural disasters. Sorry. We do so by exploiting a natural experiment, an international migration ban to all female Indonesians willing to migrate to Saudi Arabia. As I will tell you more in a second, this is a very important migration ban because it affected the second top destination country. To anticipate our results, we showed that poverty increases in villages that could no longer cope with natural disasters through international migration. All right. Together with a more general literature on migration and climate change, climatic shocks, natural disasters, this paper fits into the literature on migration and remittances as coping strategies to natural disasters. For example, here, can you see the mouse, the pointer? For example, this last paper from Bayer and Drabble, they find that countries with a high amount of remittances coming from international migrants abroad, they reduce the negative effects of natural disasters on income. So basically, remittances help overcome income shocks from natural disasters. This paper also belongs to the very small literature on the effect of restrictive migration policies on sending economies. Very important for our study, this is this paper from Marcos and co-author. They actually rely on the same migration ban to Indonesians towards Saudi Arabia, and they focus on the labor market. They don't find an increase in unemployment, as you would expect. Basically, people can no longer move. But they find that these extra workers that can no longer move, they stay and they are absorbed by the agricultural section. So we depart from their findings, but we also complement these results, as I will tell you more later why. But we also investigate if this restrictive migration policy deprives communities' capacity to absorb income shocks induced by natural disasters. All right. But before moving on with the empirical data, empirical results, and so on, this is actually, I would like to tell you a story. This is the story of Tuti Tursilawati. Tuti was an Indonesian domestic worker working in Saudi Arabia. After multiple assaults after being sexually assaulted by her Saudi employer, she killed him in self-defense. Immediately for this reason, she was sentenced to death by the Saudi authorities. The Saudi government did not even actually contact the Indonesian diplomats or the Indonesian government at all. She was sentenced to death almost immediately. This was only the tipping point of an iceberg, because many others like her were going through a lot of assaults and many other cases similar to her. For this reason, in June 2011, the Indonesian government decided to introduce a migration ban called Moratorium, which prevented millions, potentially female individuals, to migrate to Saudi Arabia as domestic workers. This ban was introduced in 2011, ratified in August 2011, but it was extended to other 21 countries in 2015, mainly North African and Middle East countries. But we're going to focus only on the Saudi Arabia, which is the most important ban affecting destination countries for Indonesians. So as a diplomatic repercussion, what happened immediately was that there was a sharp decrease in the number of migrants moving from Indonesia to Saudi Arabia. All right, now, just let me say, whenever I say migrant right now, I always mean out migrant, okay? So immigrant. So we can see there was already some decrease, and that can be due to the fact that these cases were actually increasing over time, but there was a sharp reduction between 2010 and 2011, 2012. Which did not affect, this ban did not affect other countries. As you can see, the other main destination countries remain stable. Why was this ban important? This ban was actually extremely, it had an extreme impact, especially on the main destination country, which was targeted, which was Saudi Arabia, which was the second top destination country. Here we depict the stock of migrants by country destination in 2005, so 1 year before, so one period, few years before the migration ban. As you can see, after Malaysia, yes.
Sorry, I have a small question, because you said that this moratorium only concerned Saudi Arabia.
Yes.
But on one of the headlines of the newspapers you showed, it was like written like Indonesia bars stop sending to 21 countries. So
sorry, maybe I was too fast on that. So yes, in 2011, between 2011 and still today, this ban this ban is for Saudi Arabia, and then this ban was extended in 2015 to other countries. But our period of analysis will stop in 2014. So we will not consider other countries, which are also minor, as you can see here. So the very main, so what matters would be Malaysia and Saudi Arabia. Other countries such as UAE, where else? Kuwait. Yes, those are very minor countries were affected, but after in 2015, not in 2011.
Okay.
Also, what you can see from this graph is that female migration is very important, especially because it mainly comes from migrants going to Saudi Arabia. And that's because the typical profile of migrants to Saudi Arabia from Indonesia is domestic workers. There is a strong demand from Saudi Arabia and other Gulf countries of domestic servants that could, as you know, the local population, especially the female population, cannot work for especially other male employers. That's why they import foreign work from mainly Philippines, in this case also Indonesia. And at least they used to do before the migration ban. This graph, this map is actually showing you what I just shown you in more like aggregate numbers, but here more spatially. So you can see that the top destination country is Malaysia, obviously, and a neighboring country, but also we can see some few villages that have Saudi Arabia as main destination country. This is just a zoom into one specific region. Here it is East Java, but I'll highlight that we are going to focus on the entire country. So what this map is also showing you, and that's actually important for our story, is that natural disasters, here is natural disaster events, are very are frequent events in Indonesia. Indonesia is actually ranked among the top 15 countries according to the Natural Disaster Risk Index in terms of natural disasters, how impactful they are for the lives and economy. So what this map is also showing you is something that is more useful for me to introduce the data set that we are going to use. The unit of our analysis is going to be villages. Villages are these units here, which is the fourth and the lowest administrative unit in Indonesia. As you can, just to get you an understanding, on average, a village has 2,000 inhabitants. So, and with an extension of around 2 square kilometers. So a small unit. However, we use this unit of our analysis throughout our paper. So what we do, we assemble a data set of in waves of Indonesian censuses called PODAs. These are censuses collected all across Indonesia. We assemble in 4 waves, wave of 2005, 2008, and 2011, but 2011 actually is collected at the beginning of 2011, between late 2010 and beginning 2011. So it will be like a pre-treatment period, and then 2014. We assembled this in a panel of almost 70,000 villages within 31 provinces. Each village provides information about migration, such as the stock of migrants per village disaggregated by gender, the main destination country, that's for one wave, for the first wave, so pre-period, 2005. Then it provides information about disaster. The precise question is, has there been a natural disaster in the last 3 years that caused important damages and losses? We know the type of disaster and the number of disasters since 2008. We also use alternative sources, more external sources of disasters that we geocode weather stations, but more on that later. So we validate basically our results.
Sorry, can I just ask you a question?
Sure.
Like in the census, how is the migration measured in the sense that are these families that are asked about whether a relative left, or proper village registries with destination country? I don't know.
Very good question. So usually we'll have, so these are actually censuses, so they usually go to village offices when possible, and if the information is collected, then they actually just get access to this information. If these informations are not collected, that can be possible for very rural villages or small villages. That's actually provided by an estimation, let's say by the village head. So they say, the village head says, oh yeah, in the last year, 1,000 people migrated. 80% were male and female, sorry. So that's basically the answer. So we don't know more like it's individual household level data, but all these informations are at the village level.
Thank you.
So what we are interested as an outcome is poverty. We proxy poverty as the number of issued poverty cards issued in year T-1. So poverty cards are issued by the village head, and they are provided to households that fall below the poverty line, which is established according to the Indonesian Statistical Office. And these poverty cards provide access to free health, education, and other benefits. We also use, yes.
Sorry, there are 2 questions in the chat about this. So the first one is, do you consider internal migration also? And is this data survey level or at year level?
Okay, we're gonna also consider internal migration, which is a much more important phenomenon, I have to say, in Indonesia than international migration. We are gonna check on that, seeing whether there is a substitution as an adaptation strategy from international migration to the internal migration. Quick answer, spoiler, actually, yes, there will be a substitution, which actually will not be against our results, but more on this, yes, we actually do it. Also, I saw there was another question in the chat about earthquakes. Sorry, thanks. I will not say that climatic events. I'm not a full expert on that. Actually, I'm curious to know, maybe later you can write in the chat how I could define them. Yeah, thanks. All right, so to move on about, yes, okay. So we are gonna use also alternative poverty measures. So some proxies, some it actually just measures poverty rate at the village level. Okay. All right, so first, before going more into our more elaborate strategy, we just wanted to check in Indonesia overall whether international migration is a mitigation strategy before checking what happens if it is restricted. So here we regress poverty as, again, the inverse hyperbolic sign of the number of poverty cards issued in village V at time t. On a dummy, it takes the value 1 if there has been a disaster in the last 3 years. And is migration, so which measure the migration stocks, migrant stocks. And then what matters is these interactions. So we see if there is an increase in migration, how the coefficient of beta 3 changes with respect to different levels of migrations. So, and then we include some controls such as populations and so on, time fixed effect, village fixed effect, and province linear trends. All right, but this is just an OLS, informative. So what we can see here is that this depicts the beta 3, the interaction, with no level of zero migrations. Whenever a disaster hit, there is an increase in poverty cards by 10%, which is actually what we expect. But however, as migration increases, this poverty, the effect of disasters reduces until reaching 0. So we kind of interpret these results suggesting that international migrations, very likely remittances, reduce the effect of natural disasters on poverty. Again, this is OLS. It can be informative. It doesn't establish any causal relationship. Also, because of that, but also because we are just interested in a specific case of what happens when migrations are restricted, we are going to exploit the natural disasters I just mentioned before, which is the moratorium or the migration ban. Before using it, however, we need to check whether the migration ban is effective in reducing the number of migrants migrating to Saudi Arabia. We do so in an event study. So basically, we regress the average stock here of migrants, of female migrants for villages that declare Saudi Arabia as their main destination country in 2005 against villages that have other destination countries in 2005 over time in an event study. Basically, it's like a definitive. So as you can see, the stock of female migrants was catching up with respect to the stock of migrants to other countries until 2011, which is the base category year. We could have expected, if we follow a linear trend here, linear growth, let's say, that this stock would have even been higher than in the stock of migrants to Saudi Arabia than the stock of migrants to other countries. However, what we see with respect to 2011, the stock of female migrants with villages, with Saudi Arabia's main destination country, decreased by 30%, or even 38% with respect to this kind of counterfactual scenario, in which there was a linear growth. So to answer the question, yes, question.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, there's a question by Maria Balgova, who asked whether like the existing level of poverty affects the likelihood to migrate after a disaster.
Existing level of poverty impact the likelihood to migrate after a disaster. Not sure. So in our setting, it's dynamic, let's say. So sorry, I'm not sure I got your question, to be honest. Maybe you can ask existing level of poverty. Of course, this true will be not like I will tell you more in a second what our strategy will be. So of course will be kind of definitive. So there will be differences in the regional existing level of poverty, but then the shock comes from disasters, which even increases the level of poverty. And some villages are more vulnerable than others. We will exploit this. So yes, there are different levels of poverty at the beginning. So yes. Okay.
Excuse me?
Yes.
Yes, I have a small question, please. Could you come back to the equation of your model?
Yes, but that's not our main specification, but yes.
No, it's just that the poverty is actually the dependence variable, right?
Yes.
Don't you? So you are explaining poverty by migration. Shouldn't it be the opposite?
Absolutely, there could be. There could. I'm totally with you. There is definitely reverse causality here. This is. I'm not saying it is actually something. We're not saying anything causal. Huh? This is just kind of informative. I completely agree with you. There is There is a very strong case of reverse causality here.
Okay.
Yeah, I totally agree. That's why, thank you for that. That's why we're going to exploit a triple difference in difference regression to identify the overall model. So we're going to regress poverty on disaster again, a dummy. Again, we're not only going to use a dummy, also we're going to use a number of disasters. And then dummy, which takes a value 1, if village declares the majority of migrants to Saudi Arabia in 2005, this tiny variant will be absorbed. Post 2011 dummy, which takes the value 1, if of course it's after 2011. As a normal diff and diff, here it's a triple diff and diff. We are gonna interact all the possible combination of variables with each other to control for some heterogeneous effects that can bias our results. For example, dummy D times Saudi Arabia dummy, which basically controls for the fact that villages with migration links to Saudi Arabia could behave differently to once hit by natural disasters. And they do, actually. I'll show you later. Dummy D times pose, and that's because over time, overall, maybe villages cope better to natural disasters. They actually do cope better overall because they increase their level of, sorry. Yeah, they basically are, they can anticipate the disasters. They use some technology that is improving over time. And then this is very important. This interaction, Saudi Arabia times post, controls for the fact, it controls basically absorbs the effect of the ban itself on these villages. You can imagine there are labor market outcomes. So people can no longer migrate, female skilled workers, they can no longer go, they stay. This can affect the local labor market supply and all other things. So we control this way. Our identification derives from this triple interaction here. So here we can see the effect of natural disasters on villages that are more vulnerable to the migration ban, those villages that rely on migration to Saudi Arabia. So after 2011, if these villages are hit by bans, by the disasters, how do they cope? What is natural disasters? What is the level of exposure? So we also control for male migration, to control for potential substitution to male migration, population, and a conflict. Here, fixed effect, village fixed effect, province time trends, and we clustered the village level. Question maybe on this triple diff and diff? It's not always immediate.
I don't see any question in the chat, but I'll let you know if you are some.
All right. Yeah, so for sake of time, I think I got 20 minutes, right? Maybe less. Let me jump directly to this last column, which is our preferred specification, triple diff and diff.
Okay. And Andrea, I should let you know that you have about 10 minutes left.
10 minutes, even I have to go even faster. So here we see that the effect of natural disasters on poverty is like before. So we increase overall, it increases the level of poverty. And then the interactions, for example, what is interesting is here the interaction Saudi Arabia 1, disaster equal 1, meaning that villages with migration links to Saudi Arabia tend historically overall to cope better to natural disasters. The level of poverty is lower than other villages. And that's actually due to the fact that migrants to Saudi Arabia tend to remit more than migrants to other destination countries. However, after 2011, this coefficient is completely reversed and it becomes positive and significant. So here we see the triple coefficient, triple interaction here is almost 12%. Is this 12%? No, actually, we cannot interpret. We should use marginal effects here. We calculate basically after 2011, so post equal to 1, villages with migration links to Saudi Arabia, if once hit by natural disasters, they increase the level of poverty so the number of poverty cards by 13%. Similarly, we can see another side of the coin. So if villages with migration links to Saudi Arabia after hit by natural, after 2011, if hit by natural disasters, they increase poverty by 13%. As you can see, natural disasters always increase poverty, but the effect is much stronger for these villages. Right, where does this poverty comes from? What type of disasters actually is affecting our results? What type of disasters is more damaging? So we find that our results are driven by floods, which is the most recurrent type of natural disasters in Indonesia. In our data, we find that 40% of villages declare floods as the main disaster that affected their community. So here we find that floods are those that are driving their results. All right, then we went more in depth about this because we know the floods is potentially devastating for the agricultural sector. So floods can have a specific impact on rice production, especially on the type of rice production that uses rice that is cultivated in lowland rain-fed areas. We also know, I mentioned earlier, there is a paper by Marcos and co-authors that find that the migration ban does not increase unemployment simply because those who could have migrated are actually absorbed by the agricultural sector. So we went more into this, and we realized, okay, what happens if the agricultural sector cannot absorb this extra supply of workers because of floods, and all natural disasters, and especially floods? So we actually do find that there is a particularly strong effect of natural disasters on villages with rain-fed rice cultivation. The second mechanism, which is the most intuitive, everyone could have thought of, is remittances, or the lack of remittances, obviously. We unfortunately cannot measure directly remittances with our data. So we do rely on some imperfect, I have to say, proxies. We know that migrants from Saudi Arabia on average send more remittances, and the main channel to transmissions or remittances is through banking. So we actually find that villages with banks or ATMs in 2005 are those that are suffering the most. But we don't claim this is maybe suggesting of something going on with remittances. We don't claim, obviously, it can be many other stuff. We also provide back on the envelope calculations based on another paper that find that households receiving remittances in Indonesians are less poor. Based on their calculations, we find that we calculate that between 8 and 10% increase in the number of poor households because of the lack of remittance. Okay, we have a series of robustness checks, and this is important. Someone asked for a substitution to internal migration. All right, so we thought of other potential substitutions. Substitution internal migration is the first one we can think of. Male migration. There could be government transfers, foreign aid. It could come in, flowing in an increased number because of the lack of international migration. Just keep in mind that if all these substitutions occur, that means that despite this, we find an effect. This means our estimations pick up some lower bound effects. So despite the fact that they could still migrate internally and we still find poverty, that means that the real effect is actually even stronger. We do find we proxy, I have to say, internal migration with the changes in populations minus international migration. We do find basically that yes, that there is somehow something suggesting that there is a substitution towards internal migration, but we don't find that this affects our results. Okay, well stations. Oops. We also use alternative measures of more like more than driven by the data itself, we alternative measures of extreme rainfall events that are proxies for floods. So we geocode weather stations. We take buffers around weather stations. We don't know for how many kilometers the weather station is picking up the right measures. So we take different buffers. And we, despite taking different buffers, we find a very similar and even stronger results. If we, extreme rainfall is measured, is basically we construct this as if there has been a few days recorded with extreme rainfalls, the largest rainfalls in the last 10 years. So basically that's how we construct extreme rainfall. Okay, I think I got a few minutes, 5 minutes. Yeah, I've got, some other tests. For example, parallel trends assumption. This is not a normal diff and diff. So we do basically subtract the first difference and then we check them over time. We see that there is a parallel trend. And then, of course, after 2011, the treaty group increases poverty more. Even in an event study, not just before and after, we find basically that the increase is just after 2014. Okay, but yeah, if you have more questions of this, I can talk about it later. To conclude, we find, to wrap up our results, we find first that the migration ban significantly decreased international migration stocks in villages with migration links to Saudi Arabia. And we have shown, although more like in a suggestive evidence, that it seems that overall migration seems to reduce the effect of natural disasters. However, as soon as migration is restricted in 2011, we find that poverty in villages hit by natural disasters increased by 13%. We find that this effect is mainly driven by heavy rain-induced disasters, such as floods. We identified two mechanisms. One is the lack of labor market adjustments, which is basically villages can no longer absorb these extra workers in the agricultural sector. And the second is lack of remittances. To conclude, there is a certain policy message here, is that barriers to international migration could suppress an important coping strategy to natural disasters. And we know that there could be even more barriers to international migration in the future. And we know for sure that the frequency of extreme weather events will increase because of climate change. So, and thank you for having listened.
Thanks, Andrea. Thanks for a very nice presentation. So, okay, so now it's time for discussion. So to all participants, if you have some questions, you can just raise your virtual hand and I will allow you to unmute and ask your question directly to Andrea. So I think there were a few discussions going on in the chat, but okay, yeah, about earthquakes are not climatic events.
Yeah, I just have a question. Like, I don't know, you said that you measured also that you had alternative measures of poverty. So I'm wondering how they look like, because my concern is that you also mentioned that those villages that sent more immigrants to Saudi Arabia they seem to be richer somehow, because not just the remittances, but they had more banks and more ATMs, so maybe a bit more developed. So I'm wondering whether there could be some influence of leaders being able to get more poverty cards once a disaster kicks in. So yeah, it would just be interesting to see the other measures that you have.
So very good point. First of all, no, actually, about the banks maybe it was confusing. We have an interaction. So these villages, Saudi, let's call it Saudi, times whether there is a bank, times post 2011 times. So it's a fourth different. So it won't be only these villages that have banks, but yeah, they are actually poor. Beforehand, they are poorer overall. There are cultural reasons for that, maybe geographical, but they are poorer before so you can see even once I plotted parallel trends, you can see they were poor before. So actually, it's not the case that they were richer. But if the village head can anticipate, and that's actually difficult to say, right? So conditional village fixed effect, the natural disaster is quasi-random. Obviously, floods are less random than earthquakes. But the fact that we have this triple difference, so it has to be specifically for village head that could anticipate if hit by natural disasters in this Saudi Arabia. So villages with links to Saudi Arabia. So that's where the bias has to be in. So I think it's unlikely, but we do find actually if we control for government transfers, we don't find any differences. So even if that was the case, you can imagine that there is a local government transfer. Even that we don't find any differences.
Okay, so there are two people with questions. So first, Esteban.
Sorry, just say, Maria, I forgot. We have alternative poverty measures. Just 1 second. Number of health cards, which also are given to the poor, similar, less strong results. Number of households living in slums. It's not a perfect measure, but this is the most important. We use an external data set, and here we measure the number of people below the $2 PPP poverty line. So here is an increase in 1 percentage point, the share of people living below the poverty line. Yeah, so
yeah, great.
Okay, so Esteban, go ahead, and then it will be Maria.
Great, thank you. So I had two comments that you may be able to respond to in terms of how you've been thinking about things. So one is that, of course, in some sense, these events, we think of them as plausibly exogenous, but there are areas of the country that historically have experienced these same types of events more regularly, and as a result they will have developed some will have developed more robust mitigation strategies, which could just be that they have more information about where to migrate because they migrate more frequently to deal with them, but also there may be institutions and things of that sort. So that's one piece that, I mean, it's always tricky to deal with. It's not you're not alone, but that in a sense it's hidden currently, right, in terms of how we would see those just absorbed, assuming they're time invariant in terms of some fixed effects. But there's, I think, at minimum, important, let's say, treatment heterogeneity that's there that I think is worth looking into. But also, on the other end, it's also a different question of, well, to what extent are some places, in a sense, experiencing something that's newer and that that is a more extreme event than what they have in the past that couldn't have been anticipated against. So that's one piece there. Then the other, and in a sense, it's somewhat related to what Maria was also asking about, but and that I didn't see anywhere else, is that in addition to, say, having access to banks, which is important, the other piece that is always important for migration is access to migration networks. And in some way, I think you want to incorporate that. I think in submitting something like this, that's something that will be pulled out as an omitted variable bias if you don't have a way of explaining it. It could be, of course, previous measures of some migration level or network size or things of that sort, which are, of course, not entirely exogenous either. But I think that's one element that isn't there now that I think you'll end up being confronted by at some point. So I wanted to just raise it. And
well,
Esteban, I think we missed the end of the question.
Yeah, sorry. I was just saying, so yeah, I mean, if you could share your thoughts about those two main points, the one being, in a sense, this historical versus more extreme events sort of issue, and then the second one, sorry, more explicitly around how to deal with the pre-existing access to migration networks that I think currently it's not specified, but maybe it is. But either way, yeah, how you think that might come into play in this particular setting and analysis. Thank you.
Let me start. Very great questions. Let me start from the last one. Obviously, networks are extremely important in those settings. In this setting, however, what matters, I think, even more is migration agencies that work as intermediaries. Even there are the village level, so the local people go and they can have access, that they can put in contact with the employers abroad. We don't find any differences for migration for villages with a higher or lower number. Oh, sorry, just that they have or not migration agencies. So for the moment, we don't know how to interpret these known results. But that's actually something we should definitely explore further. And I could even try to realize some form of migration networks. So saying pre-migration networks, those who have a very high, very low, to see whether there is a difference. But that's definitely something we could do. For the second question about historical, institutional way on how villages cope with natural disasters, let's say, we unfortunately cannot measure intensity per se. So meaning the how strong was the natural disaster with our data. We can probably do it with the precipitation data. We are actually working on it for the moment. But we do find the same increasing results with using the number of natural disasters. Some villages even go, the maximum is like 60 natural disasters occurred in the last 3 years. So there is also that's how we could say proxy intensity. And of course, about the fact that we have village fixed effect, they should take that into account a little bit. We also have we have the control group fixed effect times here. So I think we kind of take a lot of potential omitted bias into account. We should probably dig into this a little bit more further, potentially with some heterogeneity, some ethnic composition, so on. Interactions basically, yes. Thank you for the comments.
Okay, then we have a question from Maria. So Maria, you can unmute yourself.
Thank you very much. This is a really, really interesting paper. And I'm just kind of wondering about the kind of, let's call it the first stage, right? The migration response to the ban. And I'm just kind of curious about, I don't know, I guess I would maybe expect more substitution into different migration destinations, right? If you can't go to Saudi Arabia. And so I'm just kind of want to understand kind of more the external relevance of your results, right? So did people expect this ban to be just very temporary? Is that why we see such a huge drop in migration as a result of the ban? Or does it say something about the importance of, I guess, the existing networks for migration? I'm just kind of, this is a pretty vague question, but I'm just kind of trying to understand, what is the external validity of the specific migration response that you see to this quite specific migration ban, right? Because it's a ban at the origin country as opposed to destination, which is quite unusual.
Exactly, yes. Yes, of course, to contextualize better, because obviously we don't, it's quite unusual, as you said. About the potential substitution, we cannot measure it. Again, if that is the case, again, lower bound estimate, but that doesn't matter. For the story, I could say that, so these people that were migrating to Saudi Arabia and other Gulf countries, they were relatively unskilled. So the educational requirement to migrate there, to work there as domestic workers, was to have at least primary education completed. Whereas for other main destination countries, or destinations such as South Korea, Taiwan, Japan, for example, the minimum requirement, educational requirement, is secondary education. So you can imagine it is difficult to immediately substitute to the other destination. That's why also maybe we see that drop. Also, just want to highlight that drop. It just picks up the number of international migrants. It could be that if it were just only measuring international migrants to Saudi Arabia, that could be even stronger. But we don't know. We don't know the main destination country, unfortunately, over time. We only know in the very first week. So what I'm saying is that if we see the decrease in 30%, that 30% already takes into account all destination countries. So if it's just refined to Saudi Arabia's main destination country, we could have expected an even stronger decrease. Why Saudi Arabia? Why is there such a decrease? That's because of a peculiar situation or geographical situation of Indonesia. It's an archipelago which is far from other destination countries, and Saudi Arabia is very far. There was a ban introduced for 2 years between 2009 and 2011 to Malaysia. We actually checked, and it doesn't affect our results because it was completely ineffective. That's the story of external validity. Obviously, this ban is specific to this country, and it worked very well for Saudi Arabia. There are still people moving there. There are actually anecdotes of people moving there. But in other contexts, I'm not sure. I have to say, I'm not sure that such an extreme ban could be as effective. But we can think of immigration ban, right? That's why we actually depicted that graph. That could be potential in some contexts, such as islands, for example. They can be very effective in reducing the number of immigrants from certain countries. Yes.
Okay, so probably the last two questions before concluding this seminar. So by Lucas Funturis. So the first question is about the skills and education of people who were migrating before. So maybe I missed it in your answers before, but do you know what population are mostly affected by like this migration ban, like between low skilled and high skilled? And the second question was about like conflict events. So I suppose in Indonesia. So have you control for conflict events at a local scale? So maybe they are included in like province fixed effects.
No. Actually, we have information about conflicts in each village, in each time, in each wave. So we just include it as a control. For whatever reason, could affect our results. With or without doesn't change anything. About the startup population, that's an interesting question. Yeah, again, the village census is amazing. If just to imagine if it's such a tiny unit, but unfortunately, the information provided is not always. I mean, it's not always precise. It has for some labor market information, such as the number of factories in the village and so on. We can play around with a lot of these potential heterogeneities, but we don't know precisely what is the segment, what are the segments of the population. So we don't know how many, the number of low skilled workers and so on. Unfortunately, we don't know it. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So Maria, I guess we can close end the seminar now, but if people are interested and want to continue the discussion, we can stay later.